The claws came at my face, and I ducked half a second too late. Pain exploded across my cheek, hot and sharp, and the crowd above me roared so loud the arena floor trembled under my boots. I staggered back, tasted blood, and forced my knees to stop shaking. My opponent was 7 feet of gray muscle and bone plating, a Karathi brawler named Ghoul who had already put 3 fighters in the medical bay that week. He grinned at me with a mouthful of needle teeth, clearly enjoying himself. I was not enjoying myself. My name is Ethan Vance, and 6 months earlier I had been hauling freight between Mars and the outer stations, minding my own business, when Earth got its invitation to join something called the Grand Coalition. Big news, apparently. Aliens are real, they have been watching us for a while, and now humanity gets a seat at the table. Wonderful. What nobody explained clearly was that the seat came with conditions, and one of those conditions was that Earth had to prove itself worthy of respect by entering a fighter into the Coalition's oldest tradition, a tournament called the Trials of Vesa, held once every generation on the Valkyrie Dominion's home station. I signed up because the prize money would have paid off every debt I had twice over. I signed up because I was bored, and a little reckless, and because nobody else from Earth had the nerve. I did not sign up to get my face nearly taken off by an alien the size of an industrial loader. Ghoul lunged again. This time I did not duck. I stepped inside his reach, something none of the other fighters had tried because it looked suicidal, and drove my shoulder into his ribs. He was strong, stronger than anything built from muscle and bone had any right to be, but he was not used to someone standing that close. Aliens across a dozen systems fight with range and power. Humans fight dirty, in tight spaces, because for most of our history that was the only kind of fighting available to us. I grabbed the back of his knee and pulled. He went down hard, plates cracking against the floor, and the crowd made a sound I had never heard a crowd make before, somewhere between a gasp and a scream. I did not wait for him to recover. I planted a knee where a human ribcage would be, hoping Karathi anatomy worked the same way, and it did, because he wheezed out all his air at once and stopped moving. The referee, a small floating drone with more sensors than sense, chimed twice. I had won. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, but mostly, I felt like I might throw up. My hands would not stop shaking. Blood dripped steadily from the cut on my cheek onto the white floor, and somewhere above me thousands of beings from more than 40 worlds were on their feet, and I could not tell if they were cheering for me or against me. That was only the semi-final. The final match was 2 days later, against a fighter who did not show up. I remember standing in the tunnel beneath the arena, wrapped in bandages, sipping something the medical staff insisted would help with the swelling, when the announcement came through the translator implant lodged behind my ear. The Coalition's official language sounded like wind chimes underwater, but the translation dropped into my mind in plain English, calm and clinical. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the finalist representing the Threll Combine has withdrawn. Victory is awarded to the representative of Earth, Ethan Vance, by forfeit. I laughed, actually laughed, right there in the tunnel, because it felt like the punchline to a joke the universe had been building for months. I had won a galactic tournament without throwing a single punch in the final round. I remember thinking, with real relief, that the hard part was over. I could go home. I could pay off my debts. I could tell people at the bar back on Earth that I once knocked out something that looked like it belonged in a nightmare, and nobody would believe me, and that would be fine too. I had no idea how wrong I was. They walked me out onto the winner's platform an hour later, still bandaged, still half convinced this was some kind of elaborate prank. The arena was packed. Rows and rows of alien faces, some with too many eyes, some with none that I could see at all turned toward a small stage where a golden light shimmered overhead. A fanfare played, deep and formal. The kind of music you hear at funerals and coronations rather than sporting events. That should have been my first warning. A Valkyrie official stepped forward. I had seen his kind before, tall and pale, with faces like carved marble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore ceremonial robes stitched with silver thread, and he carried a small case that he opened with great solemnity. Inside was not a trophy. It was a ring. I stood there, blinking, waiting for someone to explain the joke, but nobody was laughing. The official raised the case above his head and announced something in that same wind chime language, and the translation dropped into my mind a second later, and this time it did not feel like a punchline at all. By ancient treaty and sacred right, the champion of the Trials of Vesa is granted the hand of Princess Isira Velkar, heir to the Valkyrie Dominion, in marriage. I actually looked around to see if there was another Ethan Vance standing behind me, because surely they did not mean me. They meant me. I was escorted off the platform not to a medical bay this time, but to a private chamber somewhere deep inside the station. All smooth white walls and low humming light, the kind of room designed to make you feel calm while everything about your life quietly falls apart. A translator drone floated beside me the entire way, and I kept asking it questions it refused to answer, telling me instead that a proper briefing would be provided shortly. The briefing came from a woman named Grace Bennett. Grace was Earth's newly appointed diplomatic attaché to the coalition, a sharp, tired-looking woman in her 40s, who had clearly not slept in several days. She walked into the chamber carrying a datapad and an expression that told me this was going to be a very long conversation. "You should sit down," she said. I did not sit down. "I want to know what is going on," I said. "That thing on the platform, the ring, tell me that was some kind of ceremonial gift and not what I think it was." Grace exhaled slowly. "Ethan," she said, "the trials of Vesa are not just a sporting competition. They never have been. For the Velkari Dominion, this tournament has been the method of selecting a consort for the reigning monarch's heir for over 300 years. Every generation, fighters from across the coalition compete, and the winner is bound by treaty to marry the princess." I stared at her. "Nobody told me that when I signed up." "Nobody told anyone that when they signed up," Grace said. "It is not exactly advertised outside Velkari space. Most competitors already know the stakes because their own governments have been preparing candidates for years, grooming them, training them from childhood, specifically for this outcome. Earth was not supposed to field a real contender. We entered you as a formality, Ethan. A gesture of good faith to show we were willing to participate in coalition traditions. Nobody expected you to actually win." "Well," I said, my voice climbing, "apparently I did." "Apparently you did," Grace agreed, and there was something almost apologetic in the way she said it. I sat down then, because my legs had stopped fully cooperating. "Can I refuse?" I asked. "Just say no thank you, take the credits, and go home." Grace's silence answered before her words did. "Technically," she said, "refusal is possible, but the treaty carries enormous political weight. If you walk away, it will be read across the entire coalition as Earth rejecting an offer of alliance from one of the oldest and most respected governments in known space. We are 3 months into our membership, Ethan. We do not yet have the standing to insult a dominion like the Velkari and expect no consequences. Trade agreements could collapse, security guarantees could be withdrawn. Other member species are already watching to see if humans can be trusted to honor our word. So it is not really a choice," I said. "It is your choice," Grace said carefully, "but I would be lying if I told you it comes without cost." I put my head in my hands and said several words that the translator drone politely declined to render into any other language, and Grace let me have that moment before continuing. "There is something else," she said. "You should meet her before you decide anything." I looked up. "Meet who?" "The princess," Grace said. "Isira. She did not choose this any more than you did, Ethan. From what I understand, she is not thrilled about it either. That, more than anything else, was what convinced me to walk through the next door instead of simply refusing outright. Not the treaties, not the trade agreements, not even Grace's tired, pleading eyes. It was the thought that somewhere in this station was another person, just as trapped by this ridiculous ancient rule as I was, and maybe we owed it to each other to at least stand in the same room before either of us decided to blow up an interstellar alliance. I did not know yet how much that single decision would change everything. The door hissed open onto a garden. That surprised me more than almost anything else that day. I had expected another sterile chamber, more white walls, more humming lights. Instead, I stepped into an open courtyard filled with silver-leafed trees and a fountain that seemed to run with something closer to liquid glass than water, catching the artificial sunlight in slow, shifting colors. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache a little, homesick for a planet I had left behind and was apparently now expected never to properly return to. And in the center of the courtyard, standing very still with her back to me, was a woman I assumed had to be the princess. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and I understood immediately why the crowd had gasped the way they did during the tournament, because whatever I had been imagining, it was not this. Isira Velkar was tall, taller than me, with pale skin that seemed to catch the light the same way the fountain did, and silver hair pulled back in a severe braid that suited the sharpness in her eyes far better than anything soft would have. She wore no crown, no jewelry, nothing that announced her rank. She did not need to. It was in the way she stood, spine straight, chin level, watching me the way a soldier watches an unfamiliar weapon, uncertain if it is dangerous or simply useless. "So," she said, in a voice that the translator rendered flat and cool, "you are the one who won." "I am," I said. because there did not seem to be a better answer. She studied me for a long moment. "You do not look like much," she said. "I have had a rough week," I said. Something flickered across her face, there and gone so fast I almost missed it. Not quite a smile, maybe the memory of one. "I am told," she said, "that I am now obligated to marry you." "So am I," I said. For what it is worth, I did not ask for this either. That seemed to matter to her more than I expected. She crossed the courtyard slowly, silent on the polished stone, and stopped a careful distance away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough that neither of us had to pretend this was anything other than what it was. "Do you know why the trials exist?" she asked. "I do not," I admitted. "Nobody explained much of anything to me before today." 300 years ago, she said, my ancestors ended a war that had lasted 4 generations by agreeing that the heir to the throne would marry whoever proved themselves the strongest across the known worlds, regardless of birth, regardless of species, regardless of politics. It was meant to be a symbol. Strength earns a place beside power, not blood alone. It was meant to prevent the throne from becoming a prize fought over by noble houses plotting behind closed doors. "That sounds almost noble," I said. "It was," she said, 300 years ago. Now it is mostly theater, a tradition kept alive because nobody in power has found the courage to end it, and because every generation, someone benefits from keeping it exactly as it is. I looked at her carefully. "You sound like you have thought about this a great deal." "I have had my entire life to think about it," she said. And there it was again, that flicker, sharper this time, something like anger held very tightly in check. I was raised knowing that whoever won the trials would become my husband. I have watched candidates train for this specific outcome since I was a child, lords who wanted the throne through me rather than beside me, officers who saw me as a stepping stone to command. I expected, if I am honest, that this generation's winner would be much the same. "And instead you got me," I said. "Instead I got you," she agreed, and this time the flicker on her face held long enough that I was almost certain it was amusement. An off-world cargo pilot with no noble blood, no political ambition, and apparently no idea what he had entered until it was already finished. "That about sums it up," I said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at me the way you might look at a puzzle piece that did not fit the picture on the box, uncertain whether that meant the piece was wrong or the picture was. "I do not know you," she said finally. "I do not know if I want to know you. But I have spent my whole life being told what my future would look like by people who never once asked what I wanted. If nothing else, Ethan Vance, you did not choose this future for me the way the others would have. That has to count for something." "It should count for something," I said. "I would like it to." She studied me a moment longer, then turned back toward the fountain, her braids swinging against her shoulder. "We will see," she said, "what it counts for." I stood there in that strange silver garden a long time after she walked away, listening to water that was not water, thinking about a life I had built for myself back on Earth that suddenly felt very far away and very small. I had entered a tournament to win some money and prove something to nobody in particular. Instead, I had won a wife I had never met, tangled myself into the politics of a species I barely understood, and put the entire future of humanity's place among the stars into the middle of a decision that was supposed to have been mine alone. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake in the guest quarters they had given me, staring at a ceiling that glowed faint silver like everything else on this station. And I thought about Asira's face when she said nobody had ever asked her what she wanted. I thought about the way her voice had gone tight and careful when she talked about lords and officers who saw her as nothing more than a prize. I thought, for the first time since stepping off that transport ship, that maybe I had not actually won anything at all. Maybe I had just been handed the opening move in a much longer game, one where I did not yet know the rules, the players, or how many people were quietly hoping I would lose. The first attempt on my life happened during breakfast, which felt deeply unfair, because I had barely finished my coffee. I use the word coffee loosely. Whatever the Velkari served in the guest wing tasted close enough that my brain accepted it, and after 2 days on the station I had stopped questioning small mercies. I was sitting alone in a quiet dining hall, going over a datapad Grace Bennett had left me, full of notes on Velkari customs I was apparently expected to memorize before any formal introduction to the royal court, when the glass beside my plate cracked without warning, and a thin dart embedded itself in the wall behind my head. I sat very still for a moment, the way you do when your body understands danger faster than your mind does. Then I moved, because staying still seemed like a poor strategy for staying alive. I rolled off my chair and under the table, which in hindsight was not much cover, and shouted for the room's security system, which the Velkari called a warden. A calm voice above me acknowledged the threat and sealed the doors, and 30 seconds later a squad of armored guards burst in, weapons raised, scanning the room with the kind of practiced urgency that told me this was not their first assassination attempt. They found nothing. Whoever had fired the dart was already gone, and the dart itself dissolved into harmless dust before anyone could examine it. Some kind of self-destructing poison delivery device designed to leave no trace of its origin. Grace arrived within the hour, out of breath, her usual composure cracked at the edges. "I am so sorry," she said. "This should never have happened. Security around you is being increased immediately." "Somebody just tried to kill me over breakfast," I said, "and I am fairly calm about that considering the circumstances, so please tell me why." Grace sat down across from me, rubbing her temples. "Because you exist, Ethan," she said. "Because you won a tournament that several very powerful families expected their own candidates to win, and your victory has disrupted plans that some of them have spent years building." "I need names," I said. "I do not have proof yet," she said. "But there are 3 noble houses whose candidates were eliminated before the final rounds, and any of them would have benefited enormously from placing their own champion beside Isira. One house in particular, the Korsk family, has been positioning their heir for this outcome since before you were born. Lord Draven Korsk was the favorite to win before you entered the tournament at all. And now, instead of marrying into the throne, he is watching an off-world stranger take his place," I said. Grace nodded grimly. "That is precisely why this is dangerous," she said. "Not because anyone thinks you are weak, because you have already proven you are not, and desperate people do desperate things when the future they planned for slips away from them." I thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over, while guards trailed me through every corridor of the station, uncomfortably close, uncomfortably armed. It was strange to realize that surviving the tournament had not made me safe. If anything, it had made me a target in an entirely new way, one where the weapons were quieter and the enemies smiled at formal dinners instead of stepping into an arena. I met Isira again 3 days later, at what the court called a welcoming banquet, though nothing about the atmosphere felt welcoming. The hall was enormous, all pale stone arches and floating lights, filled with nobles from a dozen aligned worlds, all of them watching me with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to open contempt. I wore formal clothes that had been tailored for me overnight, stiff and unfamiliar, and I felt every bit the outsider I was. Isira sat beside an empty throne meant for her father, who I was told rarely attended these functions anymore due to failing health, and when I approached to take the seat beside her, the entire hall went quiet in a way that made my skin prickle. "You survived the attempt on your life," she said quietly, once I had sat down and the low murmur of conversation had resumed around us. "Word travels fast," I said. "Word always travels fast in a court like this one," she said. "It is one of the few things you can rely on completely." I studied her carefully. She wore a formal gown the color of deep water, silver threading catching the light exactly the way her hair did, and if anyone else in that hall noticed how tightly her hands were folded in her lap, they did not show it. "You do not seem surprised," I said. "About the attempt, I mean." "I am not," she said. "I told you the trials attract those who see the throne as a prize rather than a responsibility. Draven Korsk has wanted this outcome since before either of us were old enough to understand what it meant. Losing it to you will not sit well with him, or with his father, or with the several noble houses who supported his candidacy." "Should I be worried about all of them?" I asked, only half joking. "You should be careful," she said. "There is a difference. Worry accomplishes nothing. Careful might keep you alive." Something in the way she said it, precise and unflinching, made me realize she had likely spent her entire life navigating exactly this kind of danger, quietly, without anyone ever asking if she was afraid. I found myself wondering how many attempts had been made on her own life over the years, and whether anyone outside her closest guards had ever noticed. Across the hall, I spotted a tall Velkari man watching us with an expression that was almost, but not quite, hidden behind courtesy. Silver hair, sharp jaw, robes embroidered with a crest I did not recognize yet but would soon learn to dread. "That is Draven, is it not?" I said quietly. Isira followed my gaze without turning her head fully, a skill I would come to admire in the following weeks. "It is," she said. "Smile, Ethan. Everyone is watching to see how the barbarian behaves at his first formal dinner." "I am not a barbarian," I muttered. "To this court," she said. "You are exactly that. An unrefined outsider who does not know which fork is meant for which course, who cannot speak a word of High Velkari, and who somehow, against every expectation, defeated fighters trained since childhood for exactly this purpose. They do not know what to make of you, and that frightens them more than anything a trained diplomat could have done. I picked up the wrong utensil almost immediately, which drew a soft ripple of laughter from a nearby table, quickly stifled when Asira's gaze swept over them. I felt my face heat, embarrassment mixing uncomfortably with the lingering adrenaline of nearly being killed that same morning, and for a moment, I considered simply standing up and walking out. Then Asira, without any visible change in her expression, reached over and quietly switched the utensil in front of me for the correct one, sliding it into place as though she were merely adjusting the table setting. "Nobody noticed," she said under her breath. "Eat." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing and ate, and slowly the tightness in my chest eased just slightly. The rest of the banquet passed in a blur of formal introductions I barely understood, and alliances I did not yet know I needed to track. Counselor Ren Vask, an older Velkari official with a soft voice and calculating eyes, made a point of welcoming me with words that sounded gracious and felt, somehow, like a threat wrapped in silk. General Threxa Mole, commander of the Dominion's border fleet, barely acknowledged me at all, which felt almost more unsettling than open hostility would have. It was Draven Korsk, however, who eventually approached our table directly, once the meal had finished and quieter conversations had begun to replace the formal courses. "Champion," he said, inclining his head just enough to satisfy etiquette and not 1 degree further, "I must congratulate you. Few outsiders have ever claimed victory in the trials." "Thank you," I said carefully. "Tell me," he continued, his eyes flicking briefly to Asira before returning to me. "Was it difficult, defeating fighters who had trained their entire lives for that single tournament, when you yourself had trained for none of it?" "It was difficult," I admitted, because lying seemed pointless and dangerous in a room full of people who could probably tell. "And yet you won anyway," he said, something cold sliding beneath the polite tone. "How fortunate for you." I did not miss the implication, nor the way his hand rested a fraction too casually near the ornamental blade at his belt, a piece of jewelry that suddenly felt considerably less decorative than court fashion suggested. "Fortune had very little to do with it," Asira said before I could respond, her voice cutting through the moment with quiet, absolute authority. "Ethan Vance defeated 7 trained champions using nothing but his own body and his own mind. If you wish to question the legitimacy of his victory, Lord Korsk, I would remind you that the tournament rules were set by your own ancestors 3 centuries ago, and they made no exception for outsiders." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Princess," he said. "I meant no disrespect." "Of course you did not," Asira said, and there was steel under the courtesy now, plain enough that even I could hear it. Draven bowed, shallow and correct, and withdrew, but not before his eyes met mine one final time, and in them I read something far more dangerous than jealousy. I read patience, the look of a man who had lost this particular battle but had no intention whatsoever of losing the war. Once he was gone, I turned to Asira. "Thank you," I said. "I did not do it for you," she said, though the sharpness had softened slightly. "I did it because I am tired of men like Draven treating the throne as something owed to them by birth rather than earned. Whatever else you are, Ethan Vance, you earned your place in that arena. Nobody handed it to you." "Nobody handed you your place either," I said quietly, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Surprise, maybe, that I had noticed at all. We sat together in silence for a while after that, watching the court continue its slow, glittering dance of alliances and rivalries around us, and for the first time since stepping off that transport ship, I did not feel entirely alone in the middle of it. That feeling, unfortunately, did not last long, because later that same night, walking back to my quarters through a quiet corridor lit only by soft blue emergency lighting, I heard a voice behind me that I did not recognize, low and urgent. "Champion," it said. "A word, if you value your life." I turned, every muscle tensed, half expecting another dart, another blade, another attempt disguised as court courtesy. Instead, I found a Velkari guard I did not know, young, nervous, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as though afraid of being seen. "I do not have much time," he said quietly. "My name is Kale Dorn. I serve in the princess's personal guard, and what I am about to tell you could cost me everything if the wrong ears hear it." "I am listening," I said. "The attempt on your life during breakfast," he said. It was not simply an angry noble acting alone in a fit of jealousy. There is a larger plan in motion, one that reaches further than Draven Korsk, further even than his father's house. I do not know all of it, but I know enough to tell you this. Your death was never meant to be the end of it." Someone intends to use your marriage and afterward your death to seize control of the succession entirely. My blood ran cold. Who? I asked. Cale Dorn glanced over his shoulder again, and when he answered, his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. I do not have the full names yet, he said, but I believe Counselor Vask is involved, and if I am right, this reaches all the way to the border fleet itself. You must tell the princess. And you must be very, very careful who else you tell, because I do not yet know how many ears in this palace already belong to them. Before I could ask another question, he was gone, slipping back into the shadows of the corridor as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me standing alone with my heart hammering, and the sudden, sharp understanding that whatever I had won in that arena, it was far more dangerous and far more important than I had ever imagined. I did not sleep again that night, and by the time morning light filtered pale blue through the windows of my quarters, I had made a decision. I needed to find Isira before anyone else found me first. I found her in the same silver garden where we had first spoken, standing beside the fountain with her arms crossed, watching the light shift across the glass like water. She did not turn when I entered, though I was certain she had heard my footsteps long before I reached her. You look like a man who has not slept, she said. I have not, I said. I need to tell you something, and I need you to trust that I am not exaggerating it for effect. That got her attention. She turned fully to face me, her expression sharpening into the same careful, guarded focus I had seen the very first time we met. Tell me, she said. I told her everything Cale Dorn had said, word for word as best I could remember it, watching her face carefully as I spoke. When I mentioned Counselor Vask's name, something flickered across her features, quick and controlled, but unmistakable. You believe him, I said. Cale, you believe what he told me. Cale Dorn has served my personal guard for 6 years, she said. He is not given to exaggeration, and he would not risk his position, or his life, delivering a warning he did not believe completely. If he says Vask is involved, then Vask is involved. Why would a counselor want you dead? I asked. What does he gain from it? Isira was quiet for a long moment, staring past me toward the fountain, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something colder and more distant than I had heard from her before. My father's health has been failing for over a year, she said. It is not widely known outside the highest circles of court, but it will not remain hidden much longer. When he passes, the succession moves to me, and through the marriage treaty, to my husband as well. If both of us were to die before that succession is finalized, the throne would pass instead to a council of regents, chosen from among the ruling houses, until a suitable heir could be confirmed. And Counselor Vask sits on that council, I said, understanding beginning to form. Counselor Vask chairs that council, Isira said. If both of us die at the right moment, he would hold effective control over the Dominion for years, possibly permanently, depending on how the succession laws are eventually interpreted. It would not even require him to seize the throne outright. He would simply need to delay confirmation of any new heir long enough to consolidate power around himself. And Draven Korsk? I asked. Where does he fit into this? A useful tool, she said. Angry, ambitious, and easily convinced that eliminating you would restore what he believes is rightfully his. I doubt he fully understands the larger plan. Men like Draven rarely see past their own wounded pride. We need proof, I said. Something we can bring forward publicly. Something that cannot simply be denied or buried by a counselor with enough influence to make inconvenient guards disappear. Isira studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, subtle but real. The look of someone recalculating an assumption they had been carrying for a while. You said we, she said quietly. I did, I said. I am not walking away from this, Isira. Not from the danger, and not from you. Whatever this marriage started as, I am not interested in letting a counselor decide how it ends, in your death or mine. She held my gaze a long moment, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something behind her careful composure that looked almost like relief. Then we begin tonight, she said. There is a place in the lower archives where financial records for the border fleet are kept, records that are supposed to remain sealed to anyone outside the ruling council. If General Threxa Mole has been quietly redirecting fleet resources at Vask's direction, there will be a trail, and it will be there. That sounds like exactly the kind of place with excellent security, I said. It is, she said, a faint, dangerous smile finally touching her mouth. Fortunately, I happen to be the crown princess, and Cale Dorn happens to owe me several favors. That night we moved through the station's lower levels with Cale Dorn leading the way, avoiding patrol routes he clearly knew by memory, until we reached a heavy door sealed with old-fashioned mechanical locks, rather than the digital systems used elsewhere in the palace. An intentional precaution meant to keep the most sensitive records safe from remote tampering. Isira produced a small key from beneath her collar, something she had apparently carried her entire life without anyone realizing its purpose, and the door opened onto a narrow archive room lined with data crystals. It took nearly an hour of careful searching, Kale standing watch at the door while Isira and I worked through fleet resource logs neither of us fully understood at first glance, before I finally found something that made my stomach drop. "Isira," I said quietly, "look at this." She leaned over my shoulder, and I watched her expression harden as she read the same records I had found. Transfer logs showing entire squadrons of border fleet vessels quietly reassigned over the past 8 months, moved away from their official patrol routes, and stationed instead near the capital station itself. All authorized under General Threxamol's personal seal, and all funded through accounts that traced back, through several careful layers of misdirection, to Councillor Vask's own office. "He is positioning military forces near the capital," Isira said quietly. "Enough ships to overwhelm the palace guard within minutes if the order were given." "This is not just an assassination plot," I said. "This is a coup. We need to move quickly," Isira said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "If Vask believes his plan is close to complete, he will not wait much longer to act. We need this evidence in front of the full council before he realizes it has been found." That proved to be considerably harder than either of us hoped. The following morning, Kale Dorn did not report for his shift. I learned this from Isira herself, who arrived at my quarters with an expression I had not seen on her before, something close to fear, though carefully controlled. "Kale is missing," she said. "His post was empty this morning, and nobody has seen him since last night." My stomach twisted. "Do you think Vask knows?" I asked. "I think we need to assume the worst," she said. "If Kale has been taken, we may have very little time before Vask realizes exactly how much we already know." We spent the next several hours in careful, quiet motion, gathering copies of the evidence we had found, reaching out to allies Isira trusted completely, which turned out to be a smaller list than either of us would have liked. Grace Bennett was one of them, brought quietly into our confidence despite the diplomatic risk it carried for Earth, because Isira insisted we needed at least one voice from outside Velkari politics entirely who could vouch for the evidence's authenticity if things went badly. "This is exactly the kind of situation my superiors warned me about," Grace muttered, reviewing the data crystals we handed her in a private corner of the guest wing. "Ethan, if this goes wrong, it will not just be your life at risk. It could unravel everything Earth has built with the Coalition in these first few months." "I know," I said. "But if it goes right, it stops a counselor from murdering the woman I am supposed to marry and seizing an entire star dominion for himself. I am willing to take that risk." Grace studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let us make sure it goes right," she said. That evening, as the three of us finalized plans to bring the evidence before the full ruling council the following morning, a message arrived that changed everything. It came through Isira's private channel, encrypted in a way that only her closest guards were supposed to know, and when she read it, all the color drained from her face. "What is it?" I asked. "It is Kale," she said quietly, turning the screen toward me. "He is alive, and he says he has proof that will confirm everything we already suspect, but he cannot bring it to us safely. He needs us to come to him, tonight, at the old fleet observation post on the station's outer ring." "That sounds like a trap," I said immediately. "It might be," Isira agreed. "But if there is even a chance he is telling the truth, and that he is in danger because of what he already told you, I cannot simply leave him there." I looked at her for a long moment, weighing every instinct, screaming caution against the quiet certainty in her eyes that she intended to go regardless of what I said. "Then we go together," I said. "Because whatever this is, walking into it alone helps no one." She held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and decisive, and somewhere beneath the fear building steadily in my chest, I felt something else too, something that had been growing quietly since that very first conversation in the Silver Garden, something I was only beginning to admit to myself. Whatever this marriage had started as, I no longer wanted to walk away from it, or from her. I only hoped we would both survive long enough for that to matter. The outer ring of the station was a part of the palace I had never been shown, a stretch of old corridors that had once housed the Dominion's early defense systems before newer technology made them obsolete. The lights out here were dimmer, the air colder, and every sound our footsteps made echoed far longer than felt natural. Isira moved beside me with the same controlled calm she carried everywhere. though I noticed her hand rested close to the small blade she wore hidden beneath her sleeve, a habit I suspected had kept her alive more than once before tonight. "This place has not been used in decades," she said quietly. "Kale would have known that. It is a reasonable place to hide, if hiding is truly what he is doing." "And if it is not," I said. "Then we will find out very shortly," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only the steady readiness of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this kind of danger. We found the old observation post at the end of a long corridor, a wide circular room with tall windows overlooking the stars, dust thick on every surface except a narrow path leading toward the center of the room, where a single figure stood waiting. It was not Cale Dorn. It was Counselor Ren Vask. "Princess," he said, his voice as smooth and calm as it had been at the banquet, as though we were meeting for tea rather than standing in an abandoned corner of the station in the middle of the night. "And the champion. How fortunate that you both decided to walk into my little trap so willingly. It saves me a great deal of effort." Isira's hand moved instantly toward her blade, but before she could draw it, a dozen armed figures stepped out from the shadows surrounding the room, weapons raised, cutting off any path back the way we had come. "Where is Cale?" I demanded. "Alive, for now," Vask said pleasantly. "Cooperative, once properly motivated. It really is remarkable what a person will say to protect those they care about, champion. He gave up your location the moment I made clear what would happen to his family otherwise." Isira's expression had gone completely still, the careful, controlled mask she wore in court, though I could see the fury burning just beneath it. "You are a coward, Vask," she said quietly, "hiding behind soldiers and threats because you know you could never seize this throne through anything resembling honor." "Honor," Vask said, almost laughing. "Honor is a luxury for those who inherit power instead of earning it, princess. I have served this dominion faithfully for 40 years while lesser minds sat on thrones they did nothing to deserve. Your father is dying. You are young, untested, and now bound to an outsider with no understanding of our politics whatsoever. I am not stealing anything from you. I am simply ensuring the Dominion survives the chaos your father's death will surely bring. By murdering us both," I said. "By removing an obstacle," Vask corrected calmly. "Nothing more. The council will mourn appropriately. Dravenkorsk will be quietly encouraged to challenge for regency, a young man consumed by grief and ambition in equal measure, easily guided, easily controlled. And I will simply continue doing what I have always done, guiding this dominion from the shadows where I belong." I glanced sideways at Isira, and something passed between us in that single look, an understanding built from every quiet conversation we had shared since that first meeting in the garden. She gave the smallest possible nod. "You have made one mistake," Isira said calmly, turning her attention fully back to Vask. "And what mistake is that, princess?" he asked, amused. "You assumed we came here with nothing but hope," she said, and reached slowly into the hidden pocket of her formal robes, producing a small data crystal identical to the one we had left safely with Grace Bennett hours earlier. "This copy of the fleet transfer records was never meant to remain hidden in the archive, Counselor. Grace Bennett already has a duplicate, along with a full account of everything Cale Dorn told us, ready to be presented to the full council the moment either of us fails to check in by morning." Vask's amused expression faltered, just slightly, and I felt a fierce flash of satisfaction watching him recalculate everything in real time. "You are bluffing," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Isira said. "Are you willing to stake everything on that possibility, Counselor, when the alternative is simply walking away from this room and quietly dismantling whatever remains of your plan before it destroys you completely?" For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Vask's soldiers held their weapons steady, waiting for an order that did not come, and I watched the counselor's face cycle through calculation, doubt, and something close to genuine fear. Then, from somewhere behind us, a new voice cut through the silence. "She is not bluffing." I turned to see Cale Dorn stepping into the room, bruised but very much alive, flanked by a squad of palace guards wearing the crest of the royal household rather than Vask's private security. Behind them, Grace Bennett followed at a careful distance, her expression grim but steady. "Cale?" Isira breathed, relief flooding her voice for just a moment before the careful composure returned. "I am sorry it took so long," Cale said. "Vask's people intercepted me before I could reach you, but they made the mistake of assuming a soldier of the royal guard could be broken as easily as a frightened clerk. I sent word to the palace guard the moment I found an opening, and Ambassador Bennett was kind enough to insist on accompanying them, given the evidence already in her possession." Vask's soldiers, outnumbered now and clearly uncertain who they were meant to be loyal to in this sudden reversal, slowly lowered their weapons one by one, until only Vask himself remained standing amid the wreckage of his own plan, his composure finally, completely broken. "This is not over," he snarled, though the words carried none of the confidence they might have held minutes earlier. "It is over," Isira said quietly, stepping forward with the full weight of her authority settling back onto her shoulders like a mantle she had simply set aside for a moment rather than lost. "You will stand before the full council in the morning, Counselor, and answer for treason, for the attempted murder of the Crown Princess and her intended husband, and for redirecting fleet resources meant to protect this dominion toward your own private ambitions instead. Whatever mercy you receive will depend entirely on how honestly you choose to answer for what you have done tonight." The palace guards moved to take Vask into custody, and as they led him away, still muttering protests that grew quieter with every step, I felt the tension that had been coiled in my chest for days finally begin to loosen, just slightly. "You are bleeding," Isira said suddenly, turning to me with real concern, replacing the last of her careful composure. I looked down and realized she was right. A shallow cut along my forearm I had not even noticed in the chaos, likely from brushing too close to one of the soldiers during the tense standoff. "It is nothing," I said. "It is something," she said firmly, and reached out to examine it herself, her fingers surprisingly gentle against the wound. "You did not have to come here tonight, Ethan. This danger was mine to face, born from politics you were never truly part of until a tournament forced you into them." "I chose to be part of them," I said quietly. "That has not changed since the moment I decided to walk into that garden and actually talk to you instead of simply refusing this whole arrangement outright." She looked up at me then, something soft and unguarded flickering across her face for just a moment before the familiar composure returned, though gentler now than it had been at the start of all this. "We should return to the palace," she said. "There is a great deal to prepare before the council convenes." Grace Bennett cleared her throat pointedly from a few steps away, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "I will handle the diplomatic aspects with my superiors," she said. "I imagine humanity's standing within the coalition is about to change rather significantly, once this story becomes known." "For better or worse," I said. "For considerably better, I think," Grace said. "It is not every day a member species proves it can be trusted not just to compete honorably, but to stand against corruption within an ally's own government. That is worth more to the coalition than any trade agreement I could have negotiated in years of careful diplomacy." As we walked back through the quiet corridors toward the main palace, Isira's hand found mine without either of us quite deciding to make that happen. And for the first time since stepping onto that tournament platform days ago, I did not feel like a prize being claimed, or a stranger thrown into a world I did not understand. I felt for the first time like I might actually belong here, beside her, exactly as we were. The full council convened 3 days later, in a hall far grander and colder than the banquet chamber, where I had first faced Draven Korsk's quiet contempt, and this time every eye in the room turned toward Counselor Vask rather than toward me. I stood beside Isira near the front of the chamber, formally dressed once again, though this time the stiff, unfamiliar clothing felt less like a costume, and more like armor I had earned the right to wear. Grace Bennett stood a respectful distance behind us, present as an official witness on behalf of Earth, and Cale Dorn, fully recovered and reinstated to his post with visible honors added to his uniform, stood guard at the chamber doors alongside a dozen others loyal to the crown. Vask stood alone in the center of the hall, stripped of his ceremonial robes, forced instead into the plain gray garments reserved for those awaiting judgment. He did not look at either of us as the evidence was presented, piece by piece, the fleet transfer records, Cale's testimony, the recovered communications tracing the assassination attempts back through careful layers of misdirection to his own private accounts. By the time the presentation concluded, there was no room left in the chamber for doubt, and the assembled council, including several members who had clearly once counted themselves among Vask's quiet allies, voted unanimously to strip him of his position and remand him to the Dominion's highest court for formal trial. Draven Korsk, called before the council separately once Vask's fate had been decided, proved considerably less composed than he had been at the banquet weeks earlier. Faced with evidence that Vask had been quietly manipulating his ambitions for months, feeding his resentment carefully to keep him useful without ever fully explaining the larger plan he served, Draven's anger curdled visibly into something closer to shame. "I did not know the full extent of it," he said quietly, when finally given the chance to speak. I wanted the throne, I will not pretend otherwise, but I did not know he intended murder, and I did not know he intended to use me as nothing more than a convenient shield for his own ambitions. Ysira studied him for a long moment before responding, and I watched something shift in her expression, not forgiveness exactly, but something close to understanding. "You will not be punished for another man's crimes, Lord Korsk," she said finally, "though your judgment in allowing yourself to be so easily used should give you cause for serious reflection. I would suggest you spend considerably less time resenting outcomes you cannot control, and considerably more time earning the respect you clearly believe you are owed." Draven bowed low, deeper than courtesy strictly required, and said nothing further, though I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that his attitude toward both of us shifted into something far more careful and far less hostile than it had been before. With Vask's plot fully exposed and dismantled, the political chaos that had threatened to consume the Dominion settled, slowly, into something resembling stability once again. Ysira's father, though still gravely ill, issued a formal statement from his sickbed confirming the succession and formally welcoming me, an outsider from a world barely 3 months into coalition membership, as his daughter's chosen husband and eventual consort. I remember reading that statement with Ysira beside me, in the quiet garden where we had first properly spoken, and feeling the strange, dizzying weight of exactly how far I had come from a cargo pilot hauling freight between Mars and the outer stations. "Do you regret it?" Ysira asked quietly, watching me read. "Any of it? The tournament, the danger, all of this?" I thought about the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer rather than an easy one. "I regret that I did not know the stakes when I signed up," I said. "I regret the danger it put both of us through, and the danger it still might bring in the future, because I do not think men like Vask are the last of their kind in any court, on any world. But I do not regret winning, and I do not regret you, Ysira. If I had known everything from the very beginning, I think I would still have chosen to walk into that arena." She smiled then, a real smile, warm and unguarded in a way I had rarely seen since we met, and it struck me powerfully that I had not seen this expression on her face before, not once, in all our careful conversations and dangerous nights. "Good," she said quietly, "because I find, rather unexpectedly, that I do not regret you either." The wedding, when it finally came, was nothing like the cold, formal ceremony I had imagined during those first frightened days on the station. Ysira insisted on including elements from both our worlds, a small gesture that meant more to me than she perhaps realized, silver Velkari ribbons woven alongside simple Earth traditions that Grace Bennett had helped arrange on short notice, music that blended wind chime harmonies with something closer to the songs I remembered from home. Standing before the assembled court, with Kael Dorn standing proudly among the guards of honor, and even Draven Korsk present, subdued but respectful, I found myself thinking back to that first bruising fight against Ghoul the Karathi brawler, to the moment I had assumed my only prize would be enough credits to pay off old debts and a story nobody back home would believe. I had not understood then what I was truly fighting for. I do not think anyone could have explained it to me in a way I would have believed, not the danger, not the politics, not the quiet, growing understanding that had built itself slowly between two strangers thrown together by an ancient treaty neither of us had chosen. When Ysira took my hand before the assembled court, her eyes steady and sure, in a way that held none of the guarded distance from our very first meeting, I understood finally that I had not simply won a tournament, or survived a conspiracy, or secured humanity's standing among the stars, though all of that was true as well. I had found something I had never expected to find, stepping off that transport ship months earlier with nothing but a reckless idea and a stubborn refusal to back down from a challenge. I had found someone who understood, better than anyone else could, what it meant to be handed a life you never asked for and to choose, despite everything, to build something real inside it anyway. Grace Bennett found me afterward, during the quiet celebration that followed the ceremony, holding 2 glasses of something that smelled suspiciously like champagne despite being brewed from ingredients I could not begin to name. "Earth's ambassador tells me our standing within the coalition has never been stronger," she said, handing me a glass. "Several member species have already reached out requesting formal introductions, impressed, apparently, by a species willing to stand against corruption even when it meant risking everything." "That was not exactly the plan when I signed up for a fighting tournament," I said. Grace laughed, warm and genuine, an expression I had not seen from her since this entire strange journey began. "It rarely is, Ethan," she said. "The best outcomes almost never are." I found Isrira later that evening, standing once again beside the fountain in the silver garden, watching the artificial light shift and dance across its surface exactly as she had been the very first time I saw her. "Second thoughts?" I asked, coming to stand beside her. "None," she said, without hesitation. "I was simply remembering how frightened I was, standing here weeks ago, meeting a stranger I assumed would be no different from every other ambitious suitor this tournament had ever produced. And now?" I asked. "Now," she said, turning to look at me with an expression that held none of that old caution, "I find myself looking forward to discovering exactly what kind of future we build together. Ethan Vance, champion of the trials, husband, and, if I am not mistaken, considerably more than either title alone could ever properly describe." I took her hand, and together we watched the false starlight play across the fountain, two people from worlds impossibly far apart, bound together first by an ancient treaty neither of us had chosen, and now, finally, by something we had chosen entirely for ourselves. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, for our marriage, for Earth's uncertain new place among the stars, for a galaxy far larger and stranger than I had ever imagined back when I was simply hauling freight between quiet, forgotten stations, I found that I was no longer afraid to face them. I had won more than a tournament that day in the arena. I had won a life I never could have predicted, standing in a garden of silver light, holding the hand of a woman who had once been nothing more than a mysterious prize, and had become, against every possible expectation, the truest partner I had ever known.